Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 most underrated basic cards in Hearthstone. If you're not familiar with the term basic cards, those are just the base cards that you get for playing Hearthstone. They're not craftable, they're given to you for free. Some of them you might have to unlock by leveling up heroes throughout the course of the game, but essentially everybody gets these cards eventually. Now, that said, most of these cards aren't often played. There are, of course, a ton of the class cards specifically that do show up, the Innervates and the Flame Tongue Totems of the world, but those cards aren't going to be on this list because they're not underrated. People understand those are core parts of any given class's identity. There are a couple neutral basic cards as well, stuff like Sinjin Shieldmaster that's shown up from time to time, but I think there are 5 basic cards that just got ignored, got left behind. Someone deemed them not particularly good a long time ago, and that has just sort of stayed the general sentiment in Hearthstone ever since. But I think that's unfortunate because I think some of these cards actually do have potential to be successful in top-tier competitive decks, despite the fact that they're just free cards. And this list is going to identify 5 such cards. So let's go ahead and jump into my rankings. Up first at the number 5 spot is Guardian of Kings, the Paladin minion. This guy is, considered good in Arena, but we never ever see him in Constructed, which I think is pretty unfortunate, because if you look at what this card's really about, it does a lot of things that work in Hearthstone. First and foremost, it's a 5/6 body, which is one of the most favorable stat allocations in the game, because 5 attack kills so many big things that are 5/5 or less. And in turn, the 6 health means this minion can survive making a lot of trades into the various 5/5 minions out there. So it's a very on-board, favorable minion as far as that is concerned. Now, for 7 mana, it doesn't have insane stats, right? You would expect something like 6/7, but it's still very close within the realm of reason. Not to mention the battle cry here is really nice. Cards like Anti-Healbot in the past were playable heal cards with weak bodies, and I think this one lines up very favorably to what Anti-Killbot was. Now, it's a little slower, of course, in the curve than Anti-Killbot at 7 mana instead of 5, but Paladin has a lot of ways to survive, to play into the late game, and this is another one of those cards. If you compare it to something like Ivory Knight, I think it fills a very similar spot in a deck, sort of that mid to late game minion that restores some health and develops a body. Now, of course, you do give up the card discovery generation from Ivory Knight, which is a pretty big downside when you compare those two cards directly, but you gain a lot more onboard stats, so it can trade, be more aggressive, kill your opponents, just gives you extra depth on the board. Not to mention the heal is actually more consistent than with Ivory Knight. We've all had those Ivory Knight plays where you get 3 secrets and you don't actually get a heal and you don't get a very valuable card. So although that card has some high rolls, potentially with things like Lay on Hands, it also has a ton of low rolls. This is something that would be a little bit more in the middle and more consistent, and when a deck has a lot of other powerful tools around it, the Sunkeepers and the Tyrians, sometimes that more consistent output to me could make a lot more sense than the high roll versus the low roll, risk versus reward scenario that Ivory Knight provides. So when you just look at this thing, it just makes sense. There's a lot of different things about it that seem good. They seem to work. It could fit in a variety of different mid to late game Paladin control style decks, which is an archetype that's currently popular in the game. So I'm kind of surprised people don't test this card out just a little more. I think there is an argument to be made that it's a tad slow, it just doesn't impact the board enough, but a heal gives you time, buys you turns to survive and utilize this body in a favorable way, particularly in combination with all the other things that Paladin can do well. Up next at my number 4 spot is the Frostwolf Warlord. Before there was the 4 mana 7/7, nobody knew it, but there was the Frostwolf Warlord right there, which is often a 5 mana 7/7, a 5 mana 8/8, sometimes only a 5 mana 5/5, but at the end of the day, this is still the kind of minion that can present a surprisingly big threat on the board at a very reasonable cost, which, as we've seen in Hearthstone history, can be a big impact. Another card I'd like to compare this to is Sea Giant, which is something you sometimes play 4 or 5 mana and you get an 8/8 out. Frostwolf Warlord can do a lot of the same things, but it doesn't have this big of a downside as Sea Giant. So it's a slightly more consistent card, much like I talked about in the past example. Sea Giant's a much higher risk versus reward card. Frostwolf Warlord is just a more consistent version of that doesn't have as quite a high of swing or as low of a swings as Sea Giant might. But still, with all of the token swarm style decks that we've seen in the game that continue to remain popular, particularly in this meta, Frostwolf Warlord is the kind of card that if you're just missing a really big answer, a big threat, that Bittertide Hydra style card in your deck, that Frostwolf Warlord can actually serve that purpose. And in this era where it's really easy to flood the board, this is no longer just a win more card that just puts you farther ahead when you were already ahead. You can still build wide boards even when you're behind in the game, which make Frostwolf Warlord a pretty consistent and reliable threat to put out there even in scenarios where you're already losing. At the end of the day, this is just a really high statted minion for its cost, and that's something that often works in Hearthstone, so I think people deserve to give this card another look. Now at my number 3 spot, it's Warlocks Dread Infernal. I think this is a card that by context looks much worse than the card Abyssal Enforcer, which hit with Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. But ultimately, at the end of the day, just because another card is a slightly better version of something, it doesn't make this card bad at all. And in fact, I'm still stunned that this card hasn't been more popular in past eras where we had things like Handlock and Reno Lock dominating the ladder. Dread Infernal to me always seemed like a card that could have fit in those decks pretty well for just a basic card. Because if you look at this card, it's got really solid stats for its cost, 6/6 for 6, right in line with sort of the vanilla stat allocation you'd expect, maybe a 6/7 with a Boulder Fist Ogre. But of course, the battle cry here is really good. It's a whirlwind effect that kills not only a lot of token minions that are out there in the world today, but can even do damage to heroes, which sometimes can make an important impact more than you think. Plus, just sometimes softening up other minions is really important for setting up trades, hitting those mortal coils. You can even do things like set up Hellfires, your own little mini Flame Strike, while still developing a really solid minion in the process, which is a good 10 mana turn. So it seems like this is a pretty flexible little card that can do so many different things, makes a really big impact on the board right away, which is important for cards to be playable in Hearthstone, while still developing a body. So it has tons of swing potential, just good on-board trading potential, and instant value, which is a good thing to have too. So I never really understood why this card wasn't tested more and played around with, because it seems like a good one that still could to this day make a comeback and make an impact in Hearthstone, despite being a part of the basic set. Moving on to my number 2 spot, it's Shaman's Wind Speaker, 4 mana 3/3 minion with a battle cry, give a friendly minion Wind Fury. Now, as we've seen with the Adapt mechanic in Unguro, Wind Fury feels like a pretty good thing to give cards from time to time. Even if it's just for a little bit of chip face damage, sometimes it's worth it. But often it can do crazy combo kinds of things where you hit a big minion with it and just run over an opponent. Maybe you have a minion that has a really high health but low attack value to set up multiple trades to keep token boards in check. There are all kinds of things you can do when your minion can attack twice. And since you're not really paying the cost of having a Wind Fury minion right away when it's played, in other words, with things like Thrallmar Farseer, for instance, a card nobody ever thinks of, you're paying the penalty of that Wind Fury with the stats on the board instantly. In other words, your minion is understated because it has Wind Fury. But with a card like Windspeaker, you can play the stats first, so develop the onboard stat value, and then use Windspeaker to instantly activate the Wind Fury later. So in other words, you're not putting the Wind Fury at risk before it's actually being utilized. So you're kind of banking that Wind Fury value for a future turn, which gives you a lot more control over how you utilize the Wind Fury, but also gives it a higher impact when it's used, much like an Adapt minion might do today when it adapts a minion that's already on board. So Windspeaker gives you all of the upside of Wind Fury without really any of the downside or the risk other than this small stat penalty you essentially pay with this minion itself, but that's a backloaded penalty that allows you to influence the board earlier and more directly. So there's all kinds of different ways to use this card. I don't know that there's a deck necessarily right now that fits perfectly with what Windspeaker is wont to do, because I'm not sure it's good in a token Shaman style deck, but I can just see a world where this card could become really good, and it offers a consistent enough reward and a reward with enough upside that I'm surprised it's not experimented with more, and I'm surprised that it's not run in more decks, especially with a class that has things like Flametongue Totem and Bloodlust. It seems like you could set up some really high damage potential plays with Windspeaker, so I think this is one of those cards that, even though it maybe isn't technically underrated today in this meta, it sure seems like a card to watch out for that could become surprisingly important in some other meta, some other deck down the road. And then finally, my number 1 underrated basic card, it's the Darkscale Healer. I just think this thing packs so much value into itself that I can't believe it doesn't show up more often. For a 5-mana card, you get a 4/5 body, which of course is a little bit understated. If it was a 5/5, it'd be 10 times better, but still, we see a lot of 4/5 minions out there that can find success. I mean, even most recently in things like Servant of Kalamos, for instance, a 5-mana 4/5 that has enough upside in its effect that it's playable, and Darkscale Healer seems to fit right into that same environment to me, particularly because this battle cry can do so much work. Not only is this a heal to your face, which, 2 health isn't a ton, but it's impactful. It can sometimes make the difference between a lethal next turn and surviving for a turn or two to beat that pirate warrior, right? But it also heals other minions. And I think now more than ever, we've got a Hearthstone where there's just so many minions on board all the time. And a lot of the times they've taken little chip amounts of damage, that Darkscale Healer starts to get more and more value. So instead of just healing 2 face damage, suddenly she's healing 5 minion damage as well, and you've got basically a reasonably statted minion that's giving you a 7-point heal. When you compare that to things like Anti-Keelbot in the past, you can see just how crazy this thing gets really quickly. Not to mention with taunt minions, it's kind of like giving you extra face health in the meantime. Sets up trades. It combos with other cards, particularly in Priest. Like, I still can't believe we haven't seen this card in Priest as sort of a circle of healing replacement to combo with Northshire Clerics for tons of card draw. It just seems like a really powerful card with tons of upside, reasonable stats. It should work. I don't know why it doesn't. Nobody plays it, but it seems good. I want to test it myself. I want to play with it more myself. I feel like it's just a forgotten minion that if people decided to run it here and there, they'd realize actually this is a pretty good 5-drop. Particularly in a world where Azure Drake has rotated out of standard format, maybe this could be the basic classic set, essentially replacement for a card like Azure Drake as more of a generic go-to 5-drop. Clearly not good in aggressive decks necessarily, but any more mid-range or control style deck I feel like could get some return on their value with Darkscale Healer. So I'm just flabbergasted. I'm stunned. I'm completely surprised that this card is still so underrated. I feel like everybody's just missing something with Darkscale Healer. This has to be a good card. And there you have it. That's my list. Those are my 5 most underrated basic cards in Hearthstone. Now, do remember, these are cards I consider underrated. So if a card is ever played in a normal deck nowadays, it wouldn't have made this list. No Flametongue Totems, no Innervates, no Fireballs. Those cards are correctly rated as strong basic cards. These, to me, are the forgotten cards, the cards nobody plays that still have some potential, have some likelihood to make an impact on the game in a positive way. So, I'm sure you guys have some different thoughts of your own, some cards you think are underrated. I'd love to hear those in the comments below. Until then, though, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.